All that we know about the wise men, we find in chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel. These wise men show up in verse 1 and disappear in verse 12, leaving behind many unanswered questions. And I'm going to raise those questions, which I'm sure are shared by every one of you. Who are the wise men and where did they come from? How many were there? What is the star they saw and how did it lead them to Bethlehem? How long after the birth of Jesus did they arrive in Jerusalem? How did they know that the baby was going to be the king of the Jews? 5 questions. We'll look at them briefly. After you puzzle over all these questions, as many scholars have down the centuries, you will know as little as you did at the beginning. And that is part of the perennial fascination of this Christmas story. This is how the story begins. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" Note straight away, the wise men show up in Jerusalem after the birth of Jesus. And also remember that the shepherds were there the night Jesus was born. So the wise men came sometime later. But how much later? No one really knows. Maybe a few months later, maybe a year. There is a hint, of course. It was definitely some time later, because when the wise men find Jesus, he is with his mother in a house in Bethlehem, not in a manger when the shepherds saw him. So, Magi from the east. That's all we're told about them. The term Magi is a Persian word that referred to a special class of priests in the Persian Empire. Some scholars think they could have been followers of Zoroastrianism. It appears from the book of Daniel that they existed in his day, and it even seems that Daniel was appointed head over the group of the Magi in the time of King Darius. This fact we must remember, it'll help us in a minute or so. So who were the Magi? They were the professors and the philosophers of their day. They were brilliant and highly educated scholars who were trained in medicine, history, religion, prophecy, and astronomy. They were also trained in what we would call astrology. Today, of course, we frown upon astrology. But in the beginning, astrology was connected with man's search for God. The ancients studied the skies in order to find the answers to the great questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Of course, there is a difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the science of the study of the stars. Astrology is the belief that there is a connection between the position of the stars and human destiny. And the Magi were experts in both astronomy and astrology and claimed to be able to divine the future. The important fact for us to know is that they were advisors to the king. Even if they were not kings themselves, they were definitely kingmakers. But we ask the question, why have they traveled so far from home? It was a journey of 1,000 miles from Persia to Israel. Why have they made such a treacherous journey? The answer is they have come to see the baby born King of the Jews. Now, this is fascinating. They knew a baby had been born, but they didn't know where. They knew he was a king, but didn't know his name. So they come to Jerusalem, the capital city, seeking help. They also assume that everyone must know about this baby, this king, but a great surprise awaits them. Verse 2 adds a detail that has baffled and intrigued Bible scholars and astronomers for 2,000 years. We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. What did they see, and how did they know it was his star, and how did they connect it with Israel? All fair questions to ask. It helps to remember that the wise men were students of the sky. It also helps to know that in those days it was not uncommon to associate the birth of a great ruler with unusual heavenly phenomena. The star would make perfect sense to them and would in fact fit perfectly with what they already believed. You might say that if God wanted to get a message to these pagan priests, he picked the perfect way to do it. But still, what was the star? Frankly, we don't know. The particular Greek word aster could refer to a star or a planet or a meteor or even to a comet. And over the years, there have been many theories, mainly, I think, four main theories. Some people initially thought it was Halley's Comet, but the times that Halley's Comet don't fit into the time of Jesus' birth. Some others thought the supernova, bursts of stars, but that again doesn't seem likely. A third theory, which many think likely, is a conjunction of planets. Two or three or four planets coming together. And it seems seven, I think. Well, there are many, many theories about the conjunction of planets, and there are many records of the conjunction of planets taking place around the time of Jesus' birth. But a fourth suggestion, which again is believed by most Christians, is that it was a supernatural light. A supernatural light. A light placed by God in the atmosphere, especially for the Magi to see? The truth is, we really don't know. But the mystery deepens. A star alone would not tell the Magi all they needed to know. How did they know what the star meant? Now, we are greatly helped by this fact. What fact? We know that the Jews and Persians had intermingled for at least 500 years before the birth of Christ. The Jews and the Persians. It seems they considered Daniel, who was a Jew, of course, a good Jew. They considered Daniel as one of their own. And since the time of Daniel, the Persians had known of the Jewish expectation of a Messiah. It is possible, very possible, that they even knew from the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9, the approximate time of his appearing. What they did not know was the exact time. And when they saw the star, they knew that the time had come. Now, is all this mere speculation? I want you to consider the following. What do we know? We know that the Jews were looking for a Messiah. Remember, there was 400 years of silence. We know that the Magi looked to the stars for guidance. We know that the Jews and the Magi had intermingled for at least 500 years. And we know that the Magi would notice any new sign or phenomenon in the sky. Therefore, it should not surprise us that the Magi would travel to Jerusalem to greet this new Jewish king. And the story in Matthew chapter 2 seems to fit in with everything we know. Moving on, let's look at the reaction of Herod, which I find really fascinating. Herod, when he heard the news, was disturbed. Actual meaning is he was all shook up. The idea of a baby born king of the Jews was a direct threat to him. He's also scared because the Magi are also potential threats to him. We don't know whether there were only 3 or not, but even if there were only 3, they certainly didn't travel alone. The traditional picture that we're all used to, we all see it every Christmas. 3 men riding on 3 camels across the deserts. Nothing could be further from the truth, from reality. There is no way the Magi traveled 1,000 miles across this desert by themselves. In those days, the only way you could travel in the desert was in a large caravan. The Magi would have swept into Jerusalem with great pomp and circumstance and covered with the dust of 1,000 miles. At a minimum, they would have brought with them a full military escort, along with their servants, and the total party could have amounted to more than 300 men. Imagine these 300 military, servants accompanying the 3 wise men, if there were 3. No wonder all of Jerusalem was abuzz. And that's why the Magi had no trouble gaining an audience with the king, King Herod. Now, Herod, of course, turns to the scribes and priests with just one simple question: where is this child to be born? The scribes don't have to consult their scriptures, they don't have to look it up. They already know the answer. And 700 or so years earlier, the prophet Micah had predicted the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem. That was common knowledge in Israel. It's strange that Herod didn't know it. Even little children studied it in Jewish schools. Herod now does something strange. He asks the Magi a question. When did the star first appear to them? When did the star first appear to them? Verse 7 indicates he wanted an exact time. When did it appear? He didn't tell them why he wanted to know. And of course, you have to read on in the story to find out the actual answer. And I'm reading verse 16, much later in the chapter. When Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious and gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he learned from the Magi. Notice that? In accordance with the time he learned from the Magi. Now, what does this suggest? Does it suggest that Jesus had been born 2 years earlier? Or did the star appear 2 years earlier to give the Magi plenty of time to make the journey from Persia to Jerusalem? Well, we can't be sure. So let's sum up what we have at this point. It's a very interesting situation. The Magi haven't seen the baby Jesus yet, so they don't know how old he is. The scribes know where he is to be born, but they couldn't care less. Meanwhile, Herod knows where the baby is to be born, but not how old he is. And so to make sure he kills him, what does he do? He orders the slaughter of all the baby boys in Jerusalem. In his mind, he's willing to kill them all to make sure he gets the one baby he wants killed. Then something unusual happens. As the Magi set out for Bethlehem, which was only 6 miles south of Jerusalem, lo and behold, what turns up? The star. The star they saw in the east suddenly reappears. Verse 9 is very specific. It says the star went on before them until it came and stood over the very home where the baby Jesus was. Now, this definitely sounds like a miraculous star created by God to lead the Magi to a particular house. No wonder they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Verse 11 tells us that on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. To the Magi, the baby Jesus, of course, did not look like a king. There was nothing to suggest that he was a king. And to the outward eye, he was nothing but a peasant child born in dire poverty. But to the Magi, he was a king. He possessed more royalty in a cradle than Herod possessed in his fine palace. The wise men worshipped him. what Herod craved, the baby received. And then the part that we all know very well, verse 11. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The early church fathers said that gold represented the wealth and power of a king. Frankincense was used in the temple worship of the Lord. It represents his deity. And then there is myrrh, a kind of perfume. It was used in beauty treatments, but when mixed with vinegar, it became an anesthetic. After a person died, myrrh was used to anoint the body and prepare it for burial. John tells us that the body of Jesus was bound in linen wrappings along with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. So the gift of myrrh pictures his suffering and his death. Gold pointing to his majesty because he's a king. Frankincense pointing to his deity, for he is indeed God. Myrrh pointing to his humanity, for he is destined to suffer and die. Did the Magi understand all this at that time? Probably not. Not at all, no. And so, as I close, I want to highlight 3 abiding truths that we get from this story. Firstly, if the wise men can find Jesus, then so can we. If the wise men can find Jesus, then so can you. Think of how many barriers the wise men had to cross to get to Jesus. There was a culture barrier, a distance barrier, a language barrier, a racial barrier, a religious barrier, not to speak of a hostile king and indifferent religious leaders. It wasn't easy for them to find Jesus, but they did. They did, whatever the cost, whatever it cost them. If they found him, then so can you, so can I, so can anyone. Secondly, if God can use a star to reach these pagan astrologers, then he can use anything to reach anyone, to reach anyone and everyone on earth. Sometimes, we despair when members of our family, when some of our friends, we've been telling them about Christ. We've been living the Christ life before them, but they seem to reject Christ altogether. They don't want anything to do with our Christ. This story should give us hope. Our God is infinitely creative in the things he can use to break through to people who seem to be so far from him. He can use a star. He can use a book. He can use a tract. He can use a conversation. He can use a podcast. He can use a song. He can use a prayer. He can use a chance comment or anything he desires. If God can reach the wise men, he can reach anybody. Thirdly, and finally, if the wise men offered Jesus gifts fit for a king, then so should we. At this Christmas time, give the King a fitting gift. It's good to remember that the tradition of giving gifts at Christmas time did not start with Santa Claus. No, it started with the wise men. It is good to give gifts to one another, to each other, but it is even better to give gifts to Jesus, the King. It is good to show our love to those we love, but it's even better to show love, to demonstrate love to the one who loved us when we were unlovely, the one who loved us when we were unlovely. May you and I do just that. And with that, I pray that you will all enjoy every blessing that Christmas has to offer. Amen.